Hi, everyone. This is Christopher Phillips, the Executive Director and founder of Democracy Cafe, dedicated to making ours a more connected world on local and global scales. And this is our program, Cafe Aretista. And my guest today is Jeffrey Sachs, a beloved professor and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. Jeff, thanks so much for taking the time on what has to be an extraordinarily hectic time for you.
Well, these are nerve-wracking days, that's for sure, but I'm very happy to be speaking with you.
These are nerve-wracking days, Jeff. I'm traversing right now between Chiapas, Mexico and Yucatan, Mexico. My wife is a teacher in an indigenous community. And there's some smaller communities that don't even know yet about coronavirus where we are right now.
Well, unfortunately, the virus is likely to arrive in most parts of the world. That's what we've been seeing, of course, in recent weeks. This virus is new for the human species. We don't have experience with it like we do with influenza. There's not acquired immunity. We're probably, almost all of us, vulnerable to infection. And stopping the spread is proving to be extremely difficult for reasons of the virus's nature itself. It transmits easily. It transmits person to person and off of surfaces. It transmits in a very pernicious way, which is even when the infected person spreading the disease is not symptomatic. So people sometimes don't even know that they're sick. Some people apparently have the COVID-19 all through the run of it without developing symptoms. Others are so-called pre-symptomatic. The symptoms are going to come, but even before they're symptomatic, they are spreading the virus to others. So this has proven to be very, very difficult to control.
It has been, but I'm like you, very interested and for a very long time in matters of addressing issues of global poverty, and I see it up close and personal all the time. And so I'm wondering how we can translate in these times some sense of public spirit and spiritedness to people that we may not ever meet in our entire lives. For instance, you actually were very prescient in proposing a global coffee fund that would beneficially impact some of the people that I engage in dialogues with some frequency. I see all this tied together. Global warming, global poverty, the lack of real delivery of quality health care, and the inability to just live a certain way of life with all the growing inequities before this even happened.
Well, the world is filled with paradoxes in that we have great wealth globally, but we also have intense poverty in the midst of great wealth. That always struck me as a kind of perversity. In practical terms, one needs to understand why that poverty persists, whether it's because of exploitation or because of geographic isolation or other reasons. But it's also the case that when there's great wealth, there's great capacity to help people to do better. Now, having said that, it's also true that we are a physical species, so as wealthy and smart and clever as we are, viruses come along and they pose great threats. What is the case, however, is that our capacity to meet those threats depends on solidarity. It depends on the capacity to have a public health system. One of the reasons why the United States, the richest large country in history, is reeling from the epidemic right now is that we have a for-profit private health system. We don't have the public health system that could have contained the virus in its early days. And therefore it spread for 2 months before the emergency became really so overwhelming that the politicians acted. But because the US is very rich, within the last few hours and days, Congress is voting a $2 trillion package of response. Now, imagine poor countries, they can't even see so many decimal places, so many zeros before the decimal place, I should say. $2 trillion, my God, and just voted in a matter of days. So where is our global solidarity to face this? It happens right now in a very dramatic moment that the International Monetary Fund has taken a very positive and important step of establishing an emergency financing facility. It started out at the level of about $60 billion, not $2 trillion, and for a much larger population than the United States. But immediately, around 80 countries have applied for the emergency help. And just about an hour ago, I saw that the head of the IMF and the World Bank together issued a call for a suspension of debt service payments by poor countries, because those poor country governments need the funding not to pay interest to creditors, but to mobilize any kind of emergency response that they can to the epidemic. What this shows is we have an international system. It's very weak because, unfortunately, the United States has been very neglectful of global responsibilities for a long time, even disdainful of the IMF and multilateral institutions. Trump has said, America first. From my mind, that's just a vulgarity. That's not a principle. That's an ugliness. How about humanity first, and we all work together? But we do have an international system that we need to rally around and support, and we need to call on that international system. The IMF, which is viewed skeptically in a lot of places, has a lot of money, and it has a wonderful managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, who's saying, let's make the emergency response. She has a lot of experience in humanitarian response, and she's invoking that right now. We have the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, that can help make sure that food supplies continue to move during what will be a very, very difficult lockdown period for a lot of the world economy. So we're in for weeks or months of a global emergency where global solidarity and specific money, help, resource flows, emergency supplies, food supplies will be essential. This is a real testing period.
I'm worried about the tens of millions of families that are transient right now. I travel a lot through Central America, South America, Mexico, and there's a lot of families that are traversing through Mexico right now came from Honduras. This started when there was a military coup during the Zelaya administration, when he was having a non-binding referendum to consider changing the Constitution. And the Secretary of State of the United States at the time, Hillary Clinton, supported military ouster of a democratically elected government there. So I go way back in time a little bit and see the transient population that is getting worse and worse, and how they're caught up and swept up in a storm where they're going to be maybe the last in line to even conceivably receive the kinds of resources they're going to need right now in this time of the coronavirus pandemic.
Look, there's a lot of dislocation around the world and the United States. It's not the only actor that's caused it, but it is a country that's contributed to a lot of instability in Central America, where U.S. interventions actually go back, as you well know, a century. We've stirred the pot for a very long time. We had the Contra Wars in the 1980s. There's a lot of background to grim
No.
difficulties, and Honduras and the rest of Central America are battling drought and low coffee prices and many other economic ills. And Trump was already using them as political fodder to stir up his base in the United States by attacking desperate people trying to reach asylum or safety or just get some help. Now this comes as well. So this kind of difficulty is fraught. It is in our hemisphere. Imagine the crisis in the Middle East, in Syria, in refugee camps, in Iraq. US sanctions on Iran have definitely contributed to the weakening of Iran's health system, and it put Iran right in the center of this COVID-19 epidemic. It's been a disaster, and here we have been imposing sanctions which stop the health system even from functioning. I'm afraid of Venezuela as well, because the US has been trying to topple the Maduro regime, and one way of doing that has been to try to squeeze the hell out of the country's finances through comprehensive sanctions. I regard them as illegal and immoral, even without COVID-19. But now this virus is spreading in Venezuela, in a country where the public health system is absolutely broken. So there are many, many problems all over the world. And I can tell you there's a lot of distraction, because the richest countries are fighting this epidemic right at home. And the United States, it's led by a president I regard as the worst in our history, but he's not just terrible for the world, he's terrible for his own citizens, that he's got a first order constitutional responsibility to protect. He's been absolutely incoherent in this crisis from its inception.
Well, I think it would be helpful if he actually read the Constitution, but we'll save that for another day. How do we, the people, inculcate the kind of public spirit necessary to address this, regardless of the stupidity and inanity and sociopathy above? What can we do? What can I do? Because I'm a big believer in looking in the mirror, saying, well, what can I contribute to arrest this extraordinarily pernicious development?
What we're seeing in the U.S. when we start out with the derangement of our national politics is that local politicians and in the cities and our governors are playing a leadership role. And so I would start locally. Are elderly people being protected? Are they being fed? Are they being kept out of harm's way? Does the local community understand the gravity of the situation? Sad to say, Mexico has some of the same leadership issues as the United States. The president of Mexico has failed to this moment to understand how serious this is. He's making light of it. He doesn't want the economy to stop. He doesn't understand, actually. And apparently no one's been able to reach him about this, because he has been encouraging still large events where people come together and the virus spreads massively. Mexico will have a real epidemic, and the president needs to understand this. So I think starting with local officials, local health officials, preparedness as best as possible, understanding that people 60 and over and people with the so-called prior conditions, high blood pressure, cardiovascular, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, diabetes, are very vulnerable to this virus. And so communities need to take care to keep the vulnerable people away from infection. This is very hard to do. How can people just be isolated? People need to eat. People need to stay alive. So we need to improvise everywhere. But I would encourage you to speak with the local political figures to ask for what can be done to help with the local preparedness.
Yes, the governor of Yucatan state in Mexico has been very proactive. He stepped in when the federal government still had its head in the clouds, and it's been quite admirable. It's been fascinating to me that President of Brazil, Bolsonaro, President of Mexico, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, and Trump, even though they're politically very different, I don't even know how to describe Trump politically, is the whole thing is that, well, the government, our opponents are attacking us. They're painting it in ultra narcissistic terms instead of simply opening their eyes and recognizing that this is a glaring crisis that needs to be addressed and to show some leadership.
Yeah, I think at least in some level, they're talking with each other. I don't know about AMLO, but Bolsonaro and Trump feed each other this kind of really gross ignorance. And Bolsonaro is surrounded by COVID positive people. His press secretary was the one that was standing next to Trump. There were lots of infections spreading at Mar-a-Lago when they were together. You know, at least I can speak for Trump, or not for Trump, about Trump. You know, this is a person that never should be anywhere close to responsibility or power. He's sociopathic and he's ignorant. And now we have the biggest health crisis imaginable on our hands. And every day he's displaying his utter ignorance and his contempt for science. He has surrounded himself by cronies who say the same thing. And then we have in the United States, Fox News, which is, how to put it, it's just beyond contemptible in how it traffics in propaganda every day. And this is the Murdoch empire. Murdoch is, he's a man of despicable immorality. And everywhere that Murdoch's media exists, that's the UK, Australia, the United States, governments are behind. They're right wing, they're populist, they're behind the truth. And they're scrambling ineffectually because they're so ignorant, and their bases are fed by the propaganda of the Murdoch media.
You know, everywhere I've traveled these last 20 years, in the last 2 or 3 years, I've seen extreme changes in climate. In Chiapas, where I traverse far and wide, the deforestation combined with the lack of real rainy season anymore. Yucatan State, the same thing. It's been extraordinary. And now there must be connecting this with the coronavirus. It's hard even for somebody like me who's an optimist by nature to see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Well, one literal point, we don't really know exactly how this virus entered the human population, probably in December last year in China. Was it in one of these markets where bats are sold for food, or was it some other way? Actually, nobody really knows. Nobody's sure that it comes from the bat population even, because there are other animal reservoirs as well. But the point I wanted to make is that whatever the truth is of COVID-19, we're seeing a lot of emerging infectious diseases that have as a common feature, maybe not this one, but for many of them, that they are what are called zoonoses, which mean that they're diseases from animals to humans. And it comes from humans pushing into animal reservoirs. So when we disturb the ecology and humans come face to face, as it were, with other species harboring these diseases, the pathogens pass from the animals to the humans, and we get what is called an emerging infectious disease. We've had SARS, now we have COVID-19, we've had MERS, the Middle East respiratory syndrome, probably from camel reservoir. This kind of disturbance of ecology is, throughout human history, one of the ways that the disease flow has occurred. AIDS is another zoonosis that came we call it the human immunodeficiency virus,
And
HIV.
there
But
again, you were at the vanguard.
from great apes,
Yes.
probably a century ago, the simian immunodeficiency virus. But all of this is to say, if we disturb the planet, we will face shocks like this.
Right.
2 lessons: stop disturbing the planet so recklessly, and second, prepare better in a solidaristic way. Viruses don't respect class. They don't respect our artificial sociological boundaries. Of course, the poor are always left most vulnerable because the rich have more options. But still, the recklessness of untrammeled greed destroying the environment and private health systems instead of public health systems is a shame for us. We're so rich, we can also be nice. We can care for each other, we can protect each other, and we can still have our wealth without destroying Earth at the same time.
It's so eloquently put. I remember how you were at the vanguard of the call for a global AIDS funding initiative when the pandemic broke out. One of the very first to speak out, as you are now, about calling for that sense of being profoundly one another's brother and sisters keepers, Jeff Sachs. And I thank you so much for being on our Cafe Aretista.
Well, it's great to be with you. Please take care, and all the listeners, please take care. Stay healthy.
Thank you so much.